So we've got two dishes, two Thanksgiving dishes to basically prep and cook today. So everybody's going to get to reap the benefits of this. First thing we're going to start with, though, is you're going to take the Yukon Gold potatoes and make sure they're in a decent sized pot and fill that pot with water and turn that on now. Really, it'll take about a half hour. So while that's going and getting up to a boil and then to a simmer, we're going to take and do the Brussels sprout dish first, and then we'll finish with the mashed potato. Leave the potatoes whole, skin on. Reason being, and I'm going to show you this actually, first tip and trick right now. The inside of the potato is really starchy. Now we're using Yukon Golds versus Idahos, which are kind of like the standard that I know my grandparents, oh, I can drop that. I know that my grandparents started with. The reason we're using Yukon Golds is they have a lower starch content. The higher starch content means you'll end up with a gluier mashed potato, and that's not what we're looking for in this particular type of mashed potato. This is the kind of mashed potato that you put a little bit of gravy on, but it's pretty rich, it's decadent. You will taste the potato versus tasting all the gravy and everything else. It's not a filler side dish, what we're making here. It's not just, you know, something that's gonna hold on to extra salt or hold on to extra gravy. It's going to accentuate that. So you'll really be able to taste the potato here. And the reason we don't skin it is so the skin will hold that starch in while that water is boiling. If you skin it, the cells, you actually cut open the cells on this. And I know everybody's seen a potato oxidize. Well, that's the starch that's coming out of those cells of the potato. If you peel the potato and throw it into the pot, you'll oxidize a lot of that starch into the water, which when you drain it, you lose it. So you won't have the small amounts of starch that are really in there that's going to hold the butter in an emulsion. Because if you looked at the recipe, it's a lot of butter, but you know, it's butter, it's good. And that'll hold that in an emulsion and adds to the flavor that you're looking to get for this. So we boil it whole, and then afterwards we're going to drain it and let it sit for a few minutes. Then we'll peel it, and then we'll talk about how to mash it and then get in emulsions. Now we'll get started on the Brussels sprouts. Start by turning your pan on now. Most home cooks do not heat their pan appropriately, and that's going to be a big thing. You want to make sure your saute pan or any pan that you're cooking in is already hot prior to adding anything into it. The first thing we're going to add, assuming if you're doing the vegetarian or vegan version, hold off at this point for a few minutes. Just turn your pan to low, and the temperature you're looking for right now is medium high. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our bacon. I've got 2 slices of bacon. I prefer to cut my bacon somewhat frozen, and you're going to just cut that down into about a 1/4 inch dice. It does not have to be precise. You're just looking for each piece to be moderately uniform. The reason we're looking for uniform pieces is because we're going to use the fat off of this to cook everything else in the dish. That's why I said if you're doing the vegetarian version, it's kind of hold off for a quick second. That's just adding oil to the pan. So I'll add the bacon into the pan because it's been heating up while you've been cutting, and you can hear it's already starting to sizzle, or it should already be starting to sizzle. If it's not, take it out. Wait till it starts to sizzle. You're not looking for this overwhelming heat. What we're going to do is render the fat off the bacon. Medium heat is plenty good. I use wooden spoons on all my pans, especially anything Teflon, because you want to make sure that you're able to stir in the pan and not scrape any of the metal off. As well as you can rest the wooden spoon on the pan. You don't have to worry about it getting hot. So while that's going, we're going to cut our onion. If you've already diced up your onion, great. If not, just a little quick class on how to cut an onion. There are 2 sides of an onion. You got the root end and the stem end. You're just going to shave off this root end, just barely, so you can still see it on this side. And then the same thing on the stem end, and that just allows you to have a flat surface. Then you're going to bisect the onion through the root. That way you got a nice half of a root on both sides, look like that. And then just peel the skin off. Okay, how to dice an onion. I've been cooking professionally for about 27 years, and I have seen professionals that still don't dice an onion correctly, or they do it in a way that's dangerous. So if you look at your onion, you'll see that there are little lines. They kind of look like meridian lines on a globe. This is going to be our guide for how we're going to start dicing an onion. So you're going to take your knife and you're just going to put the tip in and cut into the center without cutting this core part here. And you just follow those lines into the center. And when you get halfway, stop, because we only need a quarter of an onion. You can just cut that off. So now what you're going to be left with is an onion that's being held together by the core. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but you've seen people that then they go to dice and they start trying to slide their knife in this way to get a really nice dice. That is exactly how you cut yourself. So you don't need to do that with an onion. Let me stir the bacon, just in case you guys are working. Give the bacon a quick stir if you see it starting to get nice and brown. But the onion obviously has layers. And this is what we're going to use for our dice. So you don't need to do any other cross cutting. All you simply need to do is turn the onion sideways and then just go straight down. Having a sharp knife prevents a lot of tears. So the onion, the reason you cry from an onion, it's an olfactory thing and it's an eye thing. So the onion releases oils as you cut it. You'll notice if you ever put an onion into a pan first, it'll look like kind of like water, but it never really evaporates. So that's a natural oil that's in the onion. And that oil is what gets up into your nose and gets up into your eyes. And that's what causes inflammation and tears. It's basically an allergic reaction. You can make yourself non-reactive to it over time, but you really have to cut a lot of onions and stuff. But the ways to prevent that is to refrigerate your onion just prior to cutting it and to have a really sharp knife. Because if your knife is dull, you're going to tear into that onion versus slicing through it. The cleaner the cut, the less cells you rip open. So if you want to show, so my bacon is pretty rendered here. Got nice and brown. I got a lot of fat off this. So if you're doing the vegetarian version, add your oil at this point. And then once you get your bacon looking like this, add your onions. And we're going to turn the heat down to low. So this is going to allow us to caramelize the onions. The bacon's going to keep cooking a little bit. The temperature in this pan is going to come down because we just added onions that are they're not hot. So we don't have to worry about the bacon burning to the bottom. And while this is going, now we can do our Brussels sprouts.
If we're not using the bacon, should we add the onion now?
Yep. Once your oil is hot, add your onions. Stir them around a little bit, let them get sweaty, and then turn it down. And then they'll caramelize over the next couple of minutes. So now we're going to cut the Brussels sprouts. So once you add the Brussels sprouts, they're going to crackle. There's a lot of water in Brussels sprouts. You'll see that they're going to release that as they're cooking. They're going to kind of pop and move a little bit in the pan, and that's just the steam from the leaves that's coming out as the whole thing is absorbing oil. So at this point in the cooking process, we're going to want to add a little bit of salt. It's about a teaspoon of salt at a time that you want to add. It's easier to undersalt than it is to oversalt. And the reason we're adding salt now is so the salt can absorb into the oil and into the moisture that's coming out the Brussels sprouts. And it'll reform a crystal structure as it glazes. So the salt will melt down in the water, and then the water will evaporate and the salt will reform a crystal, but it won't be crystallized like this anymore. It'll be really small. It'll be on the sprout itself and on the bacon. And that's what gives you that even flavor where you can tell it's been salted, but you can't taste the salt. You just know that the flavor's been enhanced by the salt. This has been cooking for, I don't know, about 2 minutes now. And we can add our cranberries. If you have dried cranberries instead of fresh cranberries, great. That's awesome. Totally works well. I like using fresh cranberries. This is going to release a lot of moisture into the pan. If you just have or if you have the dried cranberries and you want to add a little water or a little vinegar, feel free, go ahead. If you want something finer than this, like, Rebecca said she diced hers and made them into eighths. That's great too, because it's just going to change the texture. It's not going to do anything to really affect the flavor at all. You're just going to potentially get a little more caramelization on the Brussels sprouts, but nothing that's too crazy. All right. One last thing to add, I got pecans on the recipe. You can use any nut you want. Hazelnuts are a great choice. Almonds, really kind of whatever you have. The reason I use pecans is they have a slightly sweeter flavor. They bring a little more crunch to the dish, and I like the look of them whole. But you can cut them up. You can use them crumbled. If they're crumbled, they're going to absorb more oil, more flavor. So it's just, I play around with this because it's a texture thing. Okay, so for the Brussels sprouts, now that the nuts are in, once the pecans or your walnuts or whatever you're using, they've got a nice little glaze to them. You see they're kind of shiny. And the cranberries, if you're using fresh cranberries, they've started to kind of like burst open. You can turn the flame off on your stove and let everything kind of start cooling down on its own. It'll still cook for a few minutes, which is okay. At this point, we're going to add a little bit of honey. And the honey is going to be used just to kind of bring everything together and sweeten it all up. You can use brown sugar, regular sugar, corn syrup, maple syrup, agave, any type of sweetener. I prefer it's called a stabilized. Any honey type sweetener is a stabilized sweetener because it holds liquid form at room temperature and doesn't break, doesn't like separate. Any of those work. So that really can be your preference. I like honey because I like keeping it as natural as possible. There really isn't anything in this dish that maybe except for the bacon that possibly has nitrates in it, unless you get uncured bacon. Everything else is pretty wholesome. The most I would put in, it would be based on sweetness and everybody, tasting it at this amount would be like a tablespoon and a half, because you don't want to overpower the pepperiness of the Brussels sprouts. The acid you're going to get from the cranberries will be sweetened up by the honey. The pecans already carry a natural sweetness as is. And you've caramelized your onions and your bacon, so the natural sugars that were in the onions are already sweet and they've contributed to the pan. So you don't really need to add a lot. But that's the great thing about this. If take a taste right now. If you think it needs more salt, add it now while it's still in the pan and the salt can kind of melt down into the dish. If you think it needs a little more sweetness, add it now. It's always easier to add, like I said, in smaller increments, and that way you're not over seasoning the dish, overpowering the dish. That's the Brussels sprout dish. I mean, for Thanksgiving, the whole process here took 15 minutes. This is a great last minute dish when the turkey's resting or you're fending off your family from really having at the Thanksgiving meal, and you just got something. This is a great dish to bring in at the last minute that is hot, presents well, looks good, tastes great. So a couple quick tips of things to do as you're prepping this recipe. If you're using bacon and you're slicing it up, I didn't put it in the recipe, but just as a tip for in the future, freeze your bacon. Maybe for 20 minutes prior to dicing it up. It'll make it easier for you to dice through it. If anybody's cut through, so I have unfrozen bacon. If anybody's attempted to slice through this, now granted, I sharpen my knives once a week, so if not more, but I mean, you can see, cutting through raw, not frozen bacon is not the most pleasant task. It moves around a lot. It's very fatty. Even a really sharp knife doesn't grip really well, but the second you freeze it, the solidity of the bacon makes it easier to cut through. And then we talked about the onion. We talked about Brussels sprouts. Really, we're on to like the mashed potatoes and the absurd amount of butter. I've already boiled these potatoes. They're skin on. You can see, you'll know they're done. Some of them will start to split a little bit in here. And you'll see some of the leaching from where the starch comes out when you peel it. It'll look a little more smooth, a little more glistening from the water. I just take a butter knife to peel these at this point. The ideal potato for this recipe is called a larat. It's a French potato. It's a French fingerling that has, you see it every now and again in the States, but it has a very nutty aroma. It's really a great potato for this. And when you cook it, like if you were to try it raw, it tastes quite like not a potato. But then the second you cook it, it is the most intense potato flavor that anybody's ever had. It's so it lends itself really well. But it's a distant cousin of a Yukon Gold potato, so they have the same starch content. So the recipes are pretty unique. But you can do this with purple potatoes. The starch content's real similar. So that works. All right, now the fun part. Most people have one of these. This was my grandmother's. I think this was from like 1965. It works really nice for mashing potatoes. However, it does not give you the smoothest finish texture. A lot of people I know have started using their handheld or a blender. I caution people against using these because these mash and whip the potatoes so fast that they pull all of the starch out, and you end up with a very gluey, rubbery potato. You could see it. It's almost like you could stretch it like a super ball. What I use, this is a ricer. So basically, you would take, I'll show you guys. Take the potato in here, and then it presses through the little holes. You can use, if you have a food mill at home, use that. That works really great too. That's we use those at work. But this gives you a finer mash of the potato than what this does, but they're basically the same thing.
There's a question about knives too when you have a second.
Yeah, ask it.
What are your favorite knives for chopping?
What are my favorite knives for chopping? Okay. So I have two favorite knives that I've used for most of my career. Well, one for most of my career and the other one just recently. I am a personal fan of global knives, and actually we'll talk about knives in just a second here. Let me finish this up and then we'll talk about them. But I'm a big fan of global knives, and I'll show you guys mine in just one second. And then I like this Miyabi chef knife that I've been using on the video today. I personally like Japanese style chef knives. I find they carry a sharper edge. The steel is a little finer. They're lighter than a European style. So like the Wusthoffs, the Henkel, Victorinox, Chicago Cutlery, those are all stainless steel knives. Stainless steel knives are great. They're very durable. They hold an edge a long time, but they take a long time to sharpen. So in the industry, for me, for sharpening, for every hour, I use my knife. So that doesn't mean I'm standing here on this demonstration, I held the knife in my hand. That counts as an hour. That means for every hour that this knife is in my hand and I'm cutting something with it, I sharpen it for a minimum 5 minutes, possibly 10 minutes. That's to keep the sharpest edge possible. It reduces wear and tear on my body because if the knife is sharper, I don't have to use as much force with my arm, et cetera, et cetera. With a European, for every hour I would put on that knife, and I think it actually goes up to an hour and a half because they're very durable and that edge lasts longer, I would still have to spend 25 minutes sharpening that knife. It takes 3 times as long to get an edge on a stainless steel knife than it does a high carbon knife that the Japanese style knives tend to use. So let me grab my global real quick and I'll. So this was my chef knife for about 25 years that I use, every day. It's a global, it's a specific Japanese style knife. It's all one piece. This is a very unique in the way of knives. I'm sure everybody has them at home. They see their knife, it has a handle. It'll have, the blade or the full tang of the knife that runs all the way through the handle, or sometimes you can't see it, like on this knife. Then it comes, a standard knife comes with a bolster, which is where the knife joins the handle. And all you're looking for is weight balance. You should be able to balance the knife at the bolster, and the blade should be the same weight as the handle. That leaves everything better for you to handle the knife constantly. Well, Global doesn't have the bolster because it's all one piece, so they can actually move their balance point into a more optimal position for handhold. So this was just comfortable for me. Not everybody likes these knives. They're solid. I mean, this is all metal. This is a unique hold. But for something that, if I'm using this for 8 or 9 hours, this weighs maybe 12 ounces. This is great for me to get through a lot of prepping.
What do you use to sharpen your knives?
So for sharpening knives, this is two-sided sharpening stone. This is a whetstone. They make 2 different kinds of stones, whetstones and oil stones. A whetstone you soak in water. If I were to sharpen, I'd have to soak this in water for about 15 minutes now. The first time you ever use one of these, you need at least an hour, upwards of a full day. So these are porous stones, and what happens is the water soaks into the pores on these stones, and as you scrape the knife across the stone, the water gets released and it forms a little slurry along with the metal on the knife, and that's what sharpens your knife. A lot of people think that that like sharpening steel that everybody sees and uses, those just hone the knife. So those take the edges of your knife blade and they just kind of shorten it down, because what happens with a sharp knife, you've got burrs on it, they kind of stick out like this. You can't really, it's microscopic, you can't see it, but that's, you know, that's what happens when you have a sharp knife. Oops, sorry. And then over time they kind of fold over, and your knife will cut, but it's not the same, you know. So that's, as your knife is dulling, the steel is actually folding over from repetitive use. What the honing steel does is it takes those folded over edges and it just knocks them off. So you get these little short burrs, so your knife feels sharp again, but it's not the same sharpness. It's just giving you longevity on that edge you had already formed. When you draw the knife against the stone, it's knocking all of that off and then pulling out more metal burrs as you're going. So it creates that edge again. And that's, you know, that's the biggest difference that I see people, you know, use. But these things are like 20 bucks. They're well worth it. You know, it maybe is a 10-minute job at home, 10 minutes every 5-6 months. I'm gonna mix these up while I check my potatoes on the stove. All right. So if everybody wants to check their potatoes real quick. You should find that they are done or very close to done. So while you're peeling it, please note, I just pulled these out and they are extremely hot. But remember, I do this for a living, so I don't have any feeling in my hands anymore. When you grab it, you should be able to just dent your thumb into it and it'll press open. The skin might crack a little bit, but that's it. Once you feel them, they're just soft enough to where you can press your thumb in. So that's it. If you're peeling these and the potatoes are hot or too hot to handle, just grab a napkin real quick.
Do you recommend salting the water when you make potatoes? Maybe I missed that.
Not for this recipe. If I'm blanching vegetables, yes. For this recipe, no, because you're taking that water and you're dumping it. So there's no real transfer of the salt between the potato and the water. You're just wasting the salt, because just like the starch is held in by the skin, the starch is held out by the potato. If you're leaving the skins on, yes, you can. But once again, I caution you, be careful as to how much salt you add to the water. You don't want it to be like pasta water where it tastes like the ocean. You'll end up with too salty mashed potatoes, because the point here for this recipe is to really taste the potato and what it's bringing out versus tasting something that's you know, salty. It shouldn't taste like a potato chip when you're done, even though potato chips are awesome. Yeah, let them cool off a little bit, but you still want them to be hot. The butter and the heat. So heat, there are a couple of things that hold emulsions. Water is one. We had water in this recipe, but you know, the transfer of water was not very much between the potatoes, so we're relying on the moisture inside the potato. The second thing that holds an emulsion is motion. So that's coming up next, which is what we're going to do. Then the third thing is heat. So we're going to really use heat and motion to kind of hold these together. And what's going to happen is, so once you get to where they're mashed, add in your butter a little bit at a time and just start stirring it. And actually, we're going to add a little bit of that cream in, because you'll see it's kind of sticky right now. So you don't need a lot. I use heavy cream. You can use milk. It's 2 tablespoons. And just in case anybody doesn't know, it's 2 tablespoons is 1 ounce, liquid ounce. You know, but it's not much compared to, you know, other recipes I've made and what my grandparents did. It was very, you know, they used to add a lot of milk, but you know, they were using Idaho potatoes. So you can see that's already soaked in, and we're stirring around. The heat's bringing and melting the butter down. Can you see that okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. But yeah, we put a couple in at a time. We'll just mix it around. Once again, I use a rubber spatula. I'm not mixing this to whip this. I'm not looking to add volume to this. That's why you use a wire whip, is to add air into something. I'm not looking to add air into this. I just want to you know, emulsify the butter and make sure it's just really allowing the potato to, you know, or allowing it to be captured by the potato and the starch that's coming out of the potato.
How much butter do you use?
I have a 1/2 pound for 1 pound of potatoes. You can use a little less or a little more. Now this is going to be, it's going to be based on your preference of texture. This is a different texture mashed potato than what a lot of people are used to. We'll almost say it's a little runnier. It'll still stand up, but it's not going to be that sticky, you know, where you can form the mountain out of it, like in Close Encounters, you know, where the guy made the mountain of mashed potatoes. This will not hold up to that, but it's still going to be a really solid mashed potato. And the reason we're using so much butter is because that's going to impart the fat into the starch, and it gives you a fuller mouthfeel. So really when you're making this and then when you're eating it, I know with the exception of Katie, who will eat all of this by the time I am done with it.
Yes, I will.
You know, you don't have to have as much because it's decadent. You know, in your mouth and on your palate, it tastes quite filling. So yeah, seasoning wise now, salt we're looking at about a teaspoon and a half. And then the other thing I had added it to the list late. It's not on the recipe. I add white pepper. You can also add cayenne pepper if you prefer. I try to avoid black pepper in a mashed potato recipe, only because it doesn't look finished. You see little dots of black pepper everywhere, as well as the flavor of white pepper is a little stronger. So it just gives you a little deeper flavor for using a little less and not altering the appearance of the potatoes. I'm sure everybody can see here. So we have a pretty nice consistent mashed potato. It's golden in color versus like an off pasty glue white, which is it's unique. You know, you're going to see this. This is the typical Yukon Gold finish. You'll see this will be more purple if you're doing a purple potato. You know, obviously if you left the skin on, it'll be darker because that skin will impart pigment into it as you're going through and mashing it. But you know, that's really it.